Learning a new language is learning new habits, asking your tongue and your lips to do things in a new way, and that is going to feel strange. We jumped into an MRI machine and we scanned our vocal tracts. We can of course see what our lips and jaws are doing, but we can't really see what's going on inside. So we were really curious to find out. He came into the office and he said, "Oh, I've got a meeting tomorrow in Miltonganese." Oh, yeah. And
This is the Language Podcast and I'm Richard Simcott. On the show today we have Anneli Haake, Swedish teacher and pronunciation expert. In this series we're giving you the tools you need to start learning a language. Today we're talking all about pronunciation, something that's often mixed up with accent. The lines between the two can get blurry, and many language learners get worried that they're going to sound like they're putting on an accent when they're trying to work on pronunciation. But if you want to represent a language with clarity so people actually understand you, it's vital we spend some time focusing on pronunciation. In many languages, using the right tone or putting the right stress on a word has a major impact on what it means. Get it wrong and people will be left scratching their heads. Swedish is the perfect way to demonstrate the importance of pronunciation and to tackle some of the fears you may have. Anneli Haake is a Swedish language teacher, author, and founder of Swedish Made. She also makes brilliant videos for social media demonstrating some of the quirks of Swedish. Anneli has a unique way of teaching pronunciation. A big focus for her is vocal anatomy, how our mouths and tongues move when we say certain words, which we'll get into later in the show. Although this conversation focuses on Swedish, the lessons are applicable no matter what the language you're learning. So let's get stuck in. Anneli, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard.
I know that your speciality is teaching Swedish specifically. And as somebody who went through the process of learning Swedish at university, it's a big job to teach the pronunciation of that language. But I mean, you really highlight the importance of pronunciation, particularly with this language, and the impact depending on the language and how the influence of this pronunciation can affect the learning process. So what are you trying to say when you explain this about Swedish?
So yeah, you're right. It is pronunciation, particularly for Swedish, is really important. I mean, as you know, Swedish is vowel rich. Mm-hmm. It's quite sing-songy. Mm-hmm. And we sometimes have perhaps unexpected tongue movements and maybe unusual stress patterns as well. And I think most Swedes don't realize that we're actually really tuned into this. Even if it's just the slightest variation from this, it can throw us off and we just don't understand. So it can make Swedish really daunting to start to speak. And I think also, I should also mention that I think Sweden as a country, this is not just true for Sweden, but it can be a bit of an English language bubble because we learn English from early school years, and so many Swedes tend to switch, which can be a bit soul-destroying. But yeah, so pronunciation is really important, and there's a lot of scope for misunderstandings. And like you said, I think it is the thing that I hear most learners say, that it is the hardest thing to learn. And this is regardless of what your first language is. Everyone says that Swedish pronunciation is difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I can attest to that. We spent an entire year studying Swedish pronunciation at university.
Amazing.
Yes. So I can attest to this with Swedish particularly. Other languages, we didn't have to spend so much time, fortunately. I mean, there's also examples that you give, with are or do, or, there are these examples that you have. And if you change the way you pronounce it in Swedish, it can have quite a different meaning. So, I mean, these are the kinds of real highlights of the importance of pronunciation in Swedish, right?
Absolutely, of course. Yeah, I think there are other languages that have like tonal variations of certain words or interjections like that. But for sure, I think it highlights that sort of sing-songy quality of the Swedish language, which is why they're fun videos to do.
Yeah, I mean, there was one thing that surprised me with sort of exactly you can almost mean the opposite sometimes with Swedish, right? When when you're pronouncing a word, it's the same word, but yeah.
There's a classic one which is like, so you learn obviously as a beginner, you learn that the word "are" or "ja," but we sometimes just say "are." It means yes. So, but if you do it with a rising tone, then it sort of means no. So you kind of go, "ah," and it's like, yeah. And then you go, "ah," and it really means like, yeah, no.
Yeah. For any Australians listening, this is kind of like your "yeah, no" or "no, yeah."
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. I love that you do that with one word, though. You don't even need to change the word, just the way you pronounce it. Oh, my word. I mean, when people are doing this and going through these steps with you, with the pronunciation of Swedish, do they ever feel that they've got this sort of, I'm putting on an accent or I'm putting on this way of speaking and feel a bit silly doing it? Do you think that's something that you come across, and how important is it?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. Absolutely. I think people can feel very silly. It is an interesting one because I think when you learn to pronounce a new word, you learn to pronounce it in that language, right? With that melody and the stress pattern or whatever. And it will make it sound like that language. So I don't know if that is sort of putting on an accent, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but it's certainly about pronunciation and prosody. That's the way I'm thinking about it. But for sure, a lot of my learners can feel really silly when they do that. So for example, in Swedish, as you probably know, we have quite a varied pitch range. And this might feel really strange for someone who speaks their first language that has a flatter pitch range. It feels very strange to sort of go. Sometimes we play with an octave. Yeah, it's like like that. So, but ultimately, I think it comes down to, I talk a lot about habits. So in the course that me and Stefan Holmström, who's the person that I've created this pronunciation course with. So he's an opera singer and a voice coach, and we talk a lot about habits. So you obviously have your pronunciation and prosody habits, your muscular habits from your first language, and learning a new language is learning new habits. So it's obviously not just about learning the new words and the grammar. It is pure anatomy to an extent, asking your tongue and your lips to do things in a new way, and that is going to feel strange, that is going to feel silly. It's a bit like Stefan often has this little thing when we talk about this, if we do like a workshop or something, he's like, cross your arms, and then you cross your arms, and then he says, now try and cross them the other way. And people are like, like that, and that is kind of how it feels, because you're doing something not in the way that you're used to. So it comes down to habits, and we have the same very ingrained sort of muscular anatomical habits. So of course, yeah, it will feel silly, and that's a good thing, because that means that you're learning new habits.
I mean, habits are one thing, but when you mention things like pitch and melody and prosody, I imagine, like me, a lot of people out there are thinking, well, do we have to be able to sing to speak Swedish? Is that something that would help?
I think it can help for sure, but you don't have to be sort of musical in any traditional sense. But I mean, I think with the pitch range, it's not like, oh, you have to hit a C sharp or whatever. It's not like that, but it is about the variety, because it helps you, well, in Swedish anyway, it helps you stress. We do a lot of stressing of syllables with volume. We do it with speed as well. We sort of elongate, but also with pitch.
I wonder if this is why Sweden keeps doing so well at Eurovision.
Oh, absolutely, 100%. There you go.
There we go. That's a secret behind ABBA. They were born in Sweden. So
Absolutely, there you go. Great pitch.
You said also at the beginning when we started talking about this thing of the English bubble in Sweden. And of course, all of the Scandinavian countries, let's be honest, tend to have very high levels of English. And so it is something you hear as a common complaint. You're learning the language and they'll sort of say, they'll go in and say something in Swedish, something basic. And then the Swedes' reaction is going to be this, oh, it's amazing, you're learning Swedish. And they'll say it.
Yeah.
They may say it in a Swedish accent, but they'll speak very good English. Is that a big problem for foreigners trying to learn a language like Swedish where English is so widespread? I mean, how do you teach people to get around this? And is it possible to get around when it's difficult to practice?
It can be incredibly hard, and it is a problem for people who live in Sweden and are learning Swedish, for sure. It's one of the most common sort of complaints. I always tell my learners that they need to explain to the person if the situation is appropriate. Obviously not if you're standing in a long queue and you only have a couple of seconds of interaction, then maybe not. But they should explain to the person, ideally in Swedish, that they are learning the language and that they would like to practice. So please, could we keep speaking Swedish? Because I think sometimes Swedes don't realize. They just think that they are being helpful. They're just choosing the smoothest mode of communication. And they don't realize that what they're actually doing, we have a word for this in Swedish, which is björntjänst, which means bear favor. And when you do a bear favor, as in the animal bear, you are doing something that you think is helpful, but it's actually the opposite. So I think telling people what you're doing and what you need is important. So if you can muster up the courage to do that, that is really helpful. Or I tell Swedish learners I have a t-shirt that says, please don't speak English to me, but it says it in Swedish. You can also wear that.
They're very nice techniques. I mean, it reminds me of my time in the Netherlands, because I lived in the Netherlands, and it's a similar issue that a lot of people learning Dutch face as well. What I used to say to them was something very similar. I used to say, I live in the Netherlands. I get all of my posts in your language, and I really love it here, and I want to integrate. And the only way to do that properly is to learn Dutch. So I'd be really, really grateful if you could tell me if I make a mistake, and I can learn. But I'm only going to learn if I get to practice.
Exactly. That's super nice. And what was the response that you got from that?
I never had anybody say, oh, absolutely not, I'm only going to speak to you in English. I think, and I also say, if I didn't know a word, I could say, actually, I don't know this word. Do you mind if I say it in English and see if you know it? And then we'd go back to Dutch, and it was fine. And after a while, it wasn't an issue anymore. But there was definitely, a period of time where you're learning the language and you have to be able to say something in English or another auxiliary language, maybe, in a country. And it's fine to do that and then go back.
Absolutely, of course it is. And I think also, a lot of learners tell me that they've learned for a bit, and then they muster up the courage to say something, and then immediately people switch and they take it very personally. They're like, that must have been, my Swedish is so terrible that they just couldn't bear, And I'm like, I'm telling them, I'm 99% sure that wasn't the case. It's just they think they're being helpful, and you have to tell them. Don't take it personally if they switch. Tell them that you want to keep speaking Swedish, but you have to tell them.
And and linked to this, if you kind of don't pronounce it exactly as the way they're expecting. And to be fair, there are certain countries where when they're not used to certain accents or ways of pronouncing things. And so sometimes it catches people off guard. In the Balkans, for example, people will come and they'll pronounce a town name, and they may say it in the way that they perceive it on the page. But it's not understandable necessarily to the people who use that word commonly in the variations of the language that they're used to hearing. And that could be the same for other things that people are trying to communicate as well. If people don't get the pronunciation quite as expected for the listener, what kinds of ways can they change things up to maybe improve that, change that so that it is understandable? And if they feel bad about it, what can they kind of do to sort of help themselves feel a bit more confident or happier that it's a learning process?
Yeah. Oh, you have to always remind yourself that it's a marathon and not a sprint and that sort of thing. But I think a lot of the time when I'm in touch with learners and they say, I said this, I know I said all the letters in this word, but they still looked at me as if I was an alien. Like, what am I doing wrong? Why are they so sensitive? Actually, a lot of the time I find that it's to do with stress. Because it is possible to say something right in terms of like you are pronouncing all the letters correctly, but the stress is off and you don't understand it. Actually, I have a story about this which relates to England, or a place in England. So, and this is not even a foreign language learner story. This is about an English person, a friend of a friend. And
we'll remain anonymous for the purposes of this story.
Yes, I hope he doesn't see this. So, but apparently he came into the office and he said, I've got a meeting tomorrow in Miltonkeys. Oh, yeah. And and his colleagues were like, you what? Excuse me? Where are you going? Miltonkeys. And obviously the place is called Milton Keynes, right? But the stress was off. But I think that's a great example because he pronounced all the letters correctly. That's fine, but the stress was off. So what I find certainly where it's like, well, I feel like I'm saying it right, but why are Swedish so sensitive? A lot of the time it's actually to do with stress. And that is maybe something that as you progress, obviously when you're a beginner, you're focusing on the vowel sounds and the trilling your R or whatever you're doing. That's fine. But then sort of to up the game a bit more is the whole issue of stress.
It's interesting you give that example with English because, English is spoken in so many different parts of the world with so many different variations, different accents, different pronunciations, different words even that are used in the different variations of English all over the globe. And if you imagine that can be a problem in English, well, it makes you understand a bit better that a language that's spoken in just one country or two countries, well, the variations are not going to be quite as big. So people are going to be even less used to hearing the thing that we say, well, it was close enough to my ear. Well, yeah, it might be as an English speaker or as a speaker of a language that's spoken on many different continents. But, Oh my word, if you're talking about languages that don't have so many first language speakers or even learners of the language, imagine how much more reduced that capacity to understand a very broad variation is going to be.
Love, travel, study, work, friendship, whatever your reason for wanting to learn a new language, Teach Yourself provides the tools you need. Choose from over 70 languages and teach yourself today. Listeners of the Language Podcast get a special 20% discount on Anneli's book, The Language Teacher Rebel. Go to teachyourself.com and use the code in the show notes. Rely on Teach Yourself, trusted by language learners for over 85 years.
What kind of methods do you use to help people bolster their pronunciation? Like in a self-study setting, for example, you're sitting at home and you pick up a book and a tape, or what do you do? What do you advise people?
So I think one thing in general, if I was going to advise someone, they're like, I want to study on my own self-studied setting, I would say definitely pay attention to and try and find resources about the anatomy of that language. I mean, we do this in Swedish, but like pay attention to the lips and the tongue and the vocal tract and so on. But the thing is that I think it's actually more reliable to feel, if you can, what you're saying than to hear it, because it seems apparently that our brains are not that reliable in terms of audio reception. So it's a bit like, you know, when you like read a text and there's a typo in it and your brain autocorrects it, right? So from what I understand, and I'm no expert in terms of neurological audio perception, but it seems that our brains can actually do that too. And if your brain hasn't been trained to hear a particular sound through your upbringing and your first language, it might not hear it. So it's not so reliable to sort of use your ears. So I think that's why it can be really helpful to sort of go deeper into the anatomy if you can, trying to focus on how the lips move, how the tongue moves. You might need to get some feedback on that, of course, so it can be difficult to do entirely on your own. But in terms of the prosody of the language, I mean, of course, like listen to music with lyrics in that language, that's nice, because then you can sort of explore certain stress patterns and how vowels are maybe elongated and so on. Another thing that I always tell people is to, if you're on your own, is to do transcriptions. Really analyze how people speak, like where you missed out on things. How does that word really sound? What was surprising to me? Why didn't I hear it? Of course, you can miss out on words because they're new vocabulary. Okay, fine, that's cool. But beyond that, it tends to be about pronunciation. There could have been letters dropped, there's reductions, contractions, that sort of thing. What syllables are stressed or not. And I think this is obviously great for listening comprehension, but it gives you really good awareness of the pronunciation patterns of that language. You kind of get like you kill two birds with one stone.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that about contractions. So, I mean, you know, people learning English, for example, will say they'll read should have, but they'll probably just hear shoulda. And do you learn that? Do we teach that to learners straight away? Do we teach both?
My personal take on this is I try to learn for Swedish, I try to teach reductions and contractions as soon as possible, because it helps, first of all, listening and then pronunciation. And I mean, it might be different in different languages. I couldn't speak to that, but certainly nobody, if you say it is, det är, nobody says that in Swedish.
Yeah.
We just say det.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, I feel like it's a bit of a waste of time, frankly, to learn det.
Yeah.
Oh, what's the e? Am I getting the right air sound? Should I trill my r or not? Blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, yeah, if you want to spend time doing that, but ultimately, all you're going to say and all you're going to hear is there.
This is kind of true. I when you were speaking about the mouth positions as well, it reminded me of a time I was studying at the University of Iceland, and one of the other students was from the United States and an ASL user, and also spoke oral English as well, but was learning Icelandic, spoken Icelandic, without being able to hear the sounds of the language clearly. And so one of the techniques that he had was to work with the teacher to actually feel the vibrations and analyze that. And I just remember that kind of just opened my eyes to the level of detail that you can go into. And indeed, it reminds me of sort of some of the things you've hinted at so far, but I'm aware that you've actually been working on this yourself, looking in collaboration with the University of Sussex about people's mouths. Talk to me a little bit more about this sort of integrated MRI scan approach, and what you're actually doing and what's going on there and how this can be used.
Yeah, so with me and my colleague Stefan Hallström, the opera singer and voice trainer that I was mentioning earlier. So we scanned our own mouths. So we were creating the Swedish pronunciation course called Tone Your Swedish, and we were super interested in this. We'd actually seen in the past on YouTube. There was this guy who had done a similar thing but for German, and he was like, I think he counted to 20 or something like that, and we thought, this is amazing, this is so interesting, because you can actually see the tongue positioning. And we were like, we have to find this in Swedish. And we were searching, couldn't find anything, and it was like, okay, we're going to have to do it ourselves then. So then we did, and then we started to collaborate with Sussex University. So me and Stefan, we jumped into an MRI machine and we scanned our vocal tracts while we did all the Swedish phonemes and spoke some Swedish words, and we counted and a few things like that. So when we talk about anatomical language habits, it happens mainly in our vocal tracts. And obviously when you're as a teacher to student, or when we speak to each other, we can of course see what our lips and jaws are doing, but we can't really see what's going on inside. So we were really curious to find out. And I feel that it's fascinating, but it really helps to show learners because it gives them a visual along with the sound, and they can visualize that and ultimately also kind of relate to it and feel, like you were saying as well, that kind of physical feedback. They can feel their tongue movements, and it's easier for me as a teacher to kind of say, your tongue is too far back, or it's too high, or it's too low. I can show them. So your tongue is probably here, but if you look at this, it should be there. Can you feel it? It's just an additional tool to visualize, because we don't think about what our tongues do most of the time.
I guess that's a legitimate question then. So if people are learning a language, I guess then if they keep in their minds to ask questions like that of their teachers or their language partners or people they're using the language with, they can say, oh, I can't quite get this sound, or I'm pronouncing this word. They can actually ask people, okay, well, where do you feel your tongue? Is it behind your teeth? Is it the roof of your mouth? And where's the air coming out? Like they can,
exactly.
I guess people can proactively, you can ask your teacher or the language partner these questions, right?
Absolutely. And you can, just like you said, I think contact points is the tip of your tongue. I mean, this is like, it helps to just familiarize yourself a little bit with so you know that that's the tip.
Yeah.
That's the blade, and then back of the tongue. And then you can kind of say, okay, so when you say this word, the tip of your tongue, is it touching your teeth, or is it touching that little shelf behind, or is it like further back? Oh, actually, it's not the tip of the tongue then, it's maybe the blade. When you say this vowel, can you feel contact between the sides and your upper teeth, or is it sort of in between? Is there no contact? So those are like really good questions that you can ask, even if that person hasn't reflected on that, but they can of course give you that feedback. Yeah.
And like, is there maybe a vibration that you feel when you say that certain sound, or is it not, or how is it? I mean, these kinds of things, I think, your insight, people just as users, even if you don't have this training, you don't have to be an expert, you can ask questions that just help you to try and position things, and then ask for more feedback, I guess, as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Oh no, I really like those kinds of techniques, and as I say, my experience in Reykjavik really opened my eyes to this as well. Just watching somebody do this and learn a language in this way, and it was really effective. I mean, somebody who couldn't hear the sounds was actually creating the oral language and representing it really, really well, and it was understandable. It was fantastic to hear.
Exactly. I think when we think about language, we think a lot about obviously the visuals of the text and you sort of take in there, but then we think about the ears, and it's like, yes, of course we use the ears, but then also some people are hard of hearing or perhaps cannot hear, and they can still speak, and there's other ways of doing it, just like you say. And just coming back to what I said earlier, that our ears are not always that reliable, because the ears have also, because of the habits that we have from our first language, has also sort of trained the neural pathways in ways that I don't understand. So it might not be quite possible for you to hear and correct. And I find that most learners aren't parrots. Most adults are not parrots. Some people are, and they should thank their lucky star. They're very blessed. which is amazing. I meet them sometimes, but most people are not. And so this whole thing about, well, just say after me, doesn't really work, because it's like, okay, I can hear you saying something, but I don't know. Firstly, I can't hear maybe what I say, like I can't hear the difference, or I can hear the difference, but how do I change it? And it's almost impossible to change that if you don't know, if you're not aware of your own habits first. Because if this is like a combination, if this is some kind of muscle coordination that's going on that doesn't exist in your language, well, then you're going to have to learn a new thing. and it can be hard to find that if you're not aware of what your habits are and what the habits are in the new language that you're learning.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess it goes hand in hand with when people know this, I'm sure, of when you hear a song on the radio and you sing it over and over again, but you've misheard the lyrics and you end up singing something completely different, but you have this listening bias almost of what you think they're saying and what they're not. And then actually you find out later, they're not really saying that. Okay.
Exactly. Well, I've been going around in England, so I've been here for 21 years, and for the first I'm going to say about first 15 years maybe. So my husband uses occasionally an expression that English people of a certain age will be familiar with. It's called, now I have to think about it so I say it right, it's a Brucey bonus.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know, it's from some kind of TV show, right?
Yes. Yep.
And this comes from the fact that the person who had the TV program was called Bruce.
Yes, Bruce Forsyth.
Right? That's right. Okay. Yeah. So he used to say, and I understood that to mean that it was like, oh, that was a bit of an unexpected good fortune. Yeah?
Yeah.
But because my brain, my Swedish brain, is not trained, my ears, so that we're talking about this kind of not being able to hear the difference, right? So in Swedish, we don't have a buzzing, or we don't, it's like so we just have a normal S, yeah? We just have a flat S. So, and Brucey, because I hadn't seen the program, Brucey didn't make a word in my brain. So I thought that it was bruisey, as in a bruise. Yeah? Because that was what my vocabulary could extend to. Yeah. Brucey wasn't a word. But I didn't hear that it wasn't bruisey because in Swedish we don't have that kind of S-Z sound. But I can say it. Yeah. So I walked around for 15 years saying, oh, that was a bit of a bruisey bonus. And then one day, my husband turned around and said, sorry, what did you just say? Bruisey, what do you mean bruise? And he was like, well, that doesn't even make any sense. Why would you have a bruise from a butt? I was like, I don't know. So just that kind of like your ears are not so reliable, and you also hear what you have your habits from your own language. Right?
Well, exactly. I think this is all very, very common. And I mean, even sometimes people will ask questions about how do you say this thing. The most typical thing that I get is the trilled R, the rrrr. And especially for English speakers, they'll say, how do I train that? My answer is sometimes you can't. Sometimes there are sounds that you may not say. You may not say. Is that something you agree with? Is that something you can give alternatives for? I always give the example of a trilled R, even in Italian or in the Balkan languages where it's normally pronounced, or even in Swedish. You've got certain variations of Swedish where it's a r sound. I'm thinking Skåne. It's very often in the south of Sweden, you'll hear a r instead of a r sound.
Yeah.
Is this an option that we should give to people, do you think? Like, pronounce it as close as you can, but there are sometimes variations that it doesn't matter that much?
100%. I'm all for that. So we actually have 3 R's in Swedish. We have a trilled one. We have the back, the guttural sort of R in the south. And in the Stockholm area, we also have a buzzing R. So a zh, zh. And I always say, like, it's up to you. Like, you can, it's not, I can't say, oh, this is the proper R and this is like, you know, there's no hierarchy. It's the same with, we have this, oh my gosh, I can't remember what the actual word is for it, but this sound. So we have regional variations there too. So in the south, I'm talking Skåne, they only use that one. And in the northern part of Sweden, they only use a forward sound, which sounds like this, sh, like you're shushing someone, yeah? And everyone in the middle, we mix. So sometimes people have the impression that it's like, oh, I can't say the it's really hard, I need to practice this. And I say, well, can you say sh? And they say, oh yeah, that's easy. Okay, well, choose that then. Because a lot of people do. That's fine. You don't have to subscribe to... We have so many different regional variations of Swedish. And I can't say that one is better than another. And I think it's nice. You can choose to you can pick and mix a bit. Obviously, when you're starting out learning a language, it can be hard to... You have to start somewhere, right? You can't just kind of go, if you're learning English, it's like, I'm now going to learn Mancunian and Liverpudlian and Scottish and Cockney, and, you know, you have to have some kind of middle ground. But in terms of particular problem areas, like you mentioned with the R, I don't think it's a problem to... I mean, I have a lot of clients, for example, who speak French. For them, it's very easy to do R. And it's like, well, okay, you're just going to sound like you're from southern Sweden. Yeah. That's cool.
Exactly. Okay. I think it's a really nice way to look at it. And also, you know, I made a video on this a while back about you don't have to say the R, like roll your R if you can't, or if you find it's not a natural thing, or sometimes people physically cannot roll their R's, and it's not the end of the world. And I'm glad I'm glad you have the similar experience. And for you, I mean, what brought you to this focus on pronunciation in your language teaching career?
Well, apart from being a language teacher, I also have a background in music. So in my teens and early adulthood, I was really into music. I played in bands, I performed, I wrote some recorded music and that kind of thing. I still do occasionally. And then I got really interested in musicology, and in particular music psychology. So that's when you use psychological research to try and understand the effects of music. And I ended up doing a PhD in this. So I think I've always been interested in this sort of intersection between music and language, because they're two powerful forms of communication. And the other reason is, of course, when I've been teaching Swedish, everyone says, regardless of where they're from, Swedish pronunciation is really hard to learn, or they find it difficult. And the fact that there were also so few resources available where you actually learn how to pronounce. So there's a lot of like, here's what we do, here's what it sounds like, but that kind of gap between what you're supposed to sound like or what it sounds like, but how do I do that?
Yeah.
So that's where that's why I've ended up in this corner.
I mean, have you got any other interesting stories to share about Swedish pronunciation? I know we've heard about the R and the do and things, but are there any others that you've come across that you'd like to share?
I mean, we have a lot of these. We talked about some of those interjections, and they're sort of fun. But I think one thing that it's maybe not that much fun, but it's interesting, and I think a lot of people don't realize, we have 3 extra vowels, and we also consider Y a vowel. So we have 9 vowels in total, but then each vowel has long and a short sound. So we're actually working with 18 vowel sounds. And if you get them wrong, there is a risk of misunderstanding. So if you get if you say a long R and you say glass, that's what you drink out of. If you have a short and glass, then that's ice cream. So just kind of like an appreciation for like, okay, there's a lot of vowels. We love our vowels. And I think it's part of what makes it sing-songy. But another thing that I often think about, which I think is interesting, is that, I think I mentioned this before, we have so many different regional accents. It's a long country. And I don't know, but I think we have well over 100 different regional accents, and where I grew up, which is in the countryside, but sort of halfway between Stockholm and the Norwegian border, I lived in a very, very small village. There was about 500 people there. Okay. And when I lived there as a child, I could tell the difference between our village accent and the neighbouring village accent, which was 6 miles down the road. There was a difference. And
I have to ask, was that Swedish miles or British miles?
No, this was British miles. It was about 10 kilometres. One Swedish mile then.
Yeah, they're very, very long, the Swedish miles. So I have to ask to be very, very precise on the meaning there.
Yeah. No, well, cool. But yeah, so I think that is so lovely. And I've lost that skill now. It was a moment in time when my ears were trained to hear that difference. But I find it fascinating that there's so much variety in a country that only has 10 million people. I do
actually, I've got to say, your example with glass and glass made me smile a little bit inside, because I thought that's the difference between Northern English and Southern English for the same thing.
I know, bath and bath, and grass and grass. Exactly. yeah. Which is a regional difference, but it's not a meaning. Yeah,
exactly.
Right?
So I mean, trying to teach a Southerner to say glass, as I do, and or a Northerner say glass.
Exactly.
It's going to be quite an interesting feat as a teacher. Yeah. But yeah, I love that. I love that there's that kind of weird correlation sometimes across languages. It's really, really cool. If you were to give the people listening now to this podcast any main takeaways or techniques or tricks or tips, what would you recommend them to do in terms of implementation for their own language learning regimen right now to improve their pronunciation in Swedish or even any other language?
If you're self-studying, get into your transcriptions. Do transcriptions with pronunciation analysis. I think that's really powerful. It can be a little bit tedious, but it is a powerful tool. Listen to music, obviously. Sing along if you can. I think that's nice. And like I mentioned earlier, pay attention to the anatomy of the language. Think about the anatomy of the language. Find someone who can explain it, or someone that you can ask questions so that they can sort of tell you where their tongue touches where, so they can explain how and not just why. Because I think it is better starting to develop your new habits as soon as possible, because otherwise you might have to spend a lot more time later on getting rid of some unwanted habits. And also, just accept that it will feel strange. That's okay. That's absolutely fine. Think about this way of crossing your arms the other way and how odd that feels. It just means that it's a new habit, like when you learn anything else.
Absolutely. Okay. I mean, that's a wonderful thing. I just want to check with you, when you do these sort of the annotations and you write down, for example, something that's being said, you're sort of transcribing something, do you also mark down maybe above the words where the stress is? For example, if it's surprising to you, for example, with...
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea to do. I think you absolutely can do that. And you can also, you can sort of do, like, if you want to, you can do a transcription, which is like, this is what I think the text will look like. You can also do one which is like, this is what it sounds like, where you don't write out the letters that are dropped, or you sort of, you absolutely, and underline where the stress falls. Yeah, that's really, really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, that's the really, really good tips, really good advice for us to kind of go forward. So thank you so much for sharing your experience and your knowledge with us, Anneli. And I'm pronouncing your name in a French way. I've been through iterations of pronouncing your name over the past few weeks because of the language influence in my own brain. And I always find it very, very interesting how sometimes things influence you in an unexpected way in unexpected places.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks for having me.
A massive thank you to Anneli Haake for joining me on the Language Podcast. Now we've tackled pronunciation, next we go to discuss listening. For that, we'll be joined by the wonderful Desta Haile, who teaches language through music. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out. Let me know what you've learned from Anneli today. Will you be paying more attention to how your tongue and mouth move when you speak? Get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. Bye bye for now.